Recording, recording. I don't have fancy music yet. Maybe video. Maybe I need to get on here and do a little dance. Um, this is the first episode of GTV, short for Grief TV. I am Desiree Stage. Um, I will read now to you a biography of myself because I don't like talking about myself. But I'm Desiree Stage. I go by Des. My pronouns are she, her. And I live on uh, Lenni Lenape land, also known as Philadelphia. It's come to be known as Philadelphia. I am an award-winning artist, suicidologist, and now an MSW student. I created a project called Live Through This about 10 years ago, which is a multimedia storytelling series that aims to reduce prejudice and discrimination against suicide attempt survivors. I sit down with them and I say, hey, you survived a suicide attempt. Tell me your story. And that is meant to, uplift some marginalized voices. I've been working on that for 10 years. And if you want to see the portraits and the stories of the people I have met with across the country, about 188 people right now, you can go to livethroughthis.org. All the words spelled out. I will also include a link in the episode notes. My work with Live Through This has received coverage from the New York Times, Associated Press, NPR, CBS Evening News, a bunch of other stuff. I also produce and co-host another podcast called Suicide and Stuff, which is a video podcast that examines suicide through a critical suicidology lens. And I produce that and co-host it with my friend and colleague, Jess Stolman-Rainey. And we, anything that has to do with suicide, we probably will talk about it there. I said I lived in Philadelphia, and I live here with my wife and children and my dogs. So that's me, and the impetus for this, because I clearly needed more things to do, having 2 toddlers and a podcast and a project and an MSW program and like a whole job as well, is in my research over the past year and my coursework that I've taken in pursuit of this MSW, I'm noticing there is no education on grief. And this is for clinical students. For social workers make up something like 65 to 80% of the mental health workforce, the therapists who will be out there interacting with people. There's no mandatory education around grief, and the elective education is kind of, people don't seem to want it. Certainly in the course I took, people said, oh, well, this isn't relevant to me. And so the same goes with suicide, which is my main topic of interest. So they dovetail in various ways. They are very relevant to one another. So it felt, I'm taking an independent study this semester around grief so that I can feel good going into practice as a clinician, as a therapist who wants to specialize in suicidality, and that means working with suicidal people, and it means working with people who have lost someone to suicide. I personally am a person who I have chronic suicidal thoughts. I have had 2 suicide attempts in my life. I've lost people that I know and or love in various contexts to suicide. I've seen the aftermath of a suicide. It's a theme in my life. And Jack, I think in our first episode coming up, tells me I was called to it, and I don't disagree. Suicide, learning about suicide is one of my very first memories. He asked me that before we started recording, and I remember losing a family friend, and I remember my family talking about it. I remember it being something that I was afraid of and curious about. And I think that was driven by the ways that the people around me were talking about this man's death. I recently asked my mom how old I was when that happened, because I figured I had to have been a little older, maybe, I don't know, 7, 8, 9. And it turns out that I was more like 2 or 3. So truly one of my first memories. And then suicide is something that has come up over the course of my life. And I knew at 16 that this was what I wanted to do with my life. And it took me a while to get here, but I started actually working with suicide when I was in my 20s. So today I'm going to talk to Jack Jordan. Again, this podcast is part of an independent study I'm doing, and I'm hoping that I can talk to people, interview people who know about grief academically, intimately, different kinds of grief in different contexts. And my ultimate goal is, because it's missing, I want to leave something behind for whoever comes next. I want this information out there and openly available, accessible for free, because this is stuff that people really need to know. We need to learn this stuff. It is relevant, absolutely relevant. Grief is relevant to everyone. So John Jordan, PhD, is, to me, he's a leader in the field. He's a leading, he's a clinician researcher. Grief is his jam, and suicide grief even more so. Jack is a licensed psychologist. He was in private practice until a couple of years ago, and he's in Rhode Island, and he specializes with survivors of suicide loss and other traumatic losses. And he did this for more than 35 years. Lots of leadership positions. We talk about some trainings that he created with organizations like AAS, the American Association of Suicidology, ADEC, the American Association for Death and Education Counseling. I think I'm a new member. AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and trainings. We talk about these trainings he's developed and why and for whom. He's done all kinds of stuff. He's published a lot around grief and counseling and clinical work with people who are grieving. So I'm really lucky to have been somebody that he was willing to talk to. Really lucky that my first episode of this podcast is with him. I had an amazing time talking to him, and we talked for a while. So the first episode is about an hour and a half. Now you know me, you know a little bit about Jack. When we actually go into the episode, he's looking at the art associated with it for the first time, the branding, and he starts to ask questions. So you deserve a little context. This GTV, the genesis of this was a shower idea. I knew that I wanted to do a podcast for this independent study, and I was thinking about how I would brand it. I like these little design projects, and so I thought, GTV, that's cute, Grief TV. And it could be a play off of HGTV. So if you've ever watched that, you can see that the font is very similar. And then I was kind of poking around, looking for, what is this perfect symbol of grief that I can use as the imagery associated with this podcast. And I started thinking about those kind of beautiful, delicate drawings of flora that we have in biology textbooks. And I think rosemary was one of the things that was suggested. And I started, Googling for ideas, because I wanted to talk to my friend who is a graphic designer, Reese Meatyard, about what we could make. And as I was poking around, I realized, no, it's the TV. The TV is the symbol for me. Very literally, the TV is the symbol of my grief that I've been working my way through, navigating for the past almost year. My grandfather died at the very beginning of COVID, about 2 weeks after we went into lockdown. He died, and he was my dad, in everything but name. He raised me. He made me who I am in so many ways. And he's just one of the most important people in my life. And he was a TV repairman. So, I just, it was right there. I was like, oh, it's the TV. And so I met up with Reese and I was like, look, I want like a vintage TV set. If you're old enough to remember what these were, they were pieces of furniture and they sat on the ground, and there were no flat screen TVs. They were thick, and you had the television tube. It was actually like this big piece of glass. And there was a lot of actual hardware involved in televisions back in the day. And I grew up amongst, the I can't remember the name of various things. I grew up with soldering irons, and there was a tool that was like a steering wheel, but it had to do with balancing the red, green, and blue in the screens, and various fuses and this and that, and cords. I grew up around that. Like when I think about it, there's a very clear image that comes to mind. And I went on service calls with him. So, it just kind of brings me back to this important part of my life that is now a bittersweet memory, and that is now representative of my grief. And I thought it was pretty poetic for that to happen as I'm kind of engaging in a really kind of intensive study of grief and podcast around grief. So I thought you guys should know that. I thought y'all should know that. And welcome to Grief TV. All right, so we are.
That's a TV set from probably about the time that your father would have been watching TV too.
Yeah.
That's not a flat screen, 64-inch.
Yeah, that was my
hanging on the wall.
Yeah, I know, it's so weird to have a TV hanging on the wall. When I was growing up, we had the sets it was actually a piece of furniture.
Right, exactly. I remember.
But yeah, those are the ones that's what he worked on, and his career now would be obsolete. But
yeah,
it's
he would change the radio vacuum tubes and TV sets. Yep.
Yeah, we had a bunch. We had just like baskets of them in his workshop, which was our garage. So
yep.
Yeah, that was part of the inspiration when I went to my artist friend, and I was like, look, I want, kind of a more vintage TV. I want the old testing screen that they used to come on at
yeah.
In the large.
So you had someone design that for you.
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. And I eventually want to get a tattoo like this. We added the rabbit ears too, for
Yep.
for full effect.
That definitely dates it.
Yeah.
No cable then.
2 or 3 channels that you could get in.
Right.
But yeah, it's such a fun little symbol of my grief, and that's kind of what brought us to this conversation, and just what I'm experiencing now. And I actually have my grandfather sitting here with me eating a steak.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, it's been a rough year. And so, I mean, I always wanted to learn more about grief, and I've wanted to do grief work, clinically. I think there's a lot of grief that surrounds lived experience too, direct lived experience of suicidality. But I think that there's value in having both sides, in knowing more about both sides, and my expertise is in lived experience. So this is the year that I'm kind of focusing on starting to look at the other side and kind of dig in on the academics and the applied knowledge. So
good. Yep.
I'm super glad that you were willing to talk to me.
Sorry?
I'm glad that you were willing to talk to me. I'm really grateful.
Yeah. I'm happy to.
Yeah.
So are we recording you?
We are recording.
Okay.
We're on Grief TV, GTV, with you, Jack Jordan. Tell me about you and how you came to grief work, and how you came to suicide grief work specifically, even though we just talked about this personally.
Sure. Well, I was I sort of always had an orientation or a mindset, even as I came into clinical psychology, around I don't know if I guess I would call it a kind of a spiritual orientation and to spiritual issues and questions for people. So I never was very interested in, just treating phobias, or something like that. I was interested in helping people around the sort of existential questions in life. Um, the main loss and biggest loss in my life was my father's death of cancer when I was in my mid 20s, which was too soon for him and too soon for me. And I think that was a sort of transformational event in my life to lose him, and that got me interested in doing grief and bereavement work. Also, I was in graduate school when he died. So I was always kind of interested in it. I got involved with I helped start a peer supervision group right after graduate school of people who were interested in doing grief and bereavement work. At the time, we were all, really hepped up about family therapy. So we called ourselves the Family Laws Project, and we were all clinicians interested in helping families deal with grief and bereavement. And I certainly saw other people with other problems, a lot of marital counseling and other kinds of issues, even a couple of phobias, But so what drew me into suicide and suicide bereavement was a couple things. One, I call myself a distant survivor. I had a great uncle die in 1987 of suicide. And I also had one client early in my career who took his life, sort of. And the reason I say sort of is that I was seeing a couple in couples therapy. They decided to end the marriage and stop the therapy. And they did. A couple months after that, the husband killed himself. And then the wife came back to see me for a while. And I don't remember if that was the first suicide loss survivor I ever worked with, but it probably wasn't. But that got me kind of interested, and I did some soul searching about that I missed something, et cetera. Although technically he wasn't in therapy with me at the time that he ended his life. He terminated the therapy. What really got me into suicide bereavement was just a realization I had one day. I was seeing a number of survivors, suicide loss survivors, in my practice, but I was seeing them one-on-one, and I had a kind of, I call it an epiphany or realization, which said to me, these people ought to be talking to each other. Even though I was seen as an expert in it, I knew there were things that they could get by talking to other people going through it. Of the expertise that comes from lived experience, that I couldn't give them from my own lived experience. So I started a survivor support group in my practice, and that group ran for about 13 years. There was turnover in who was in it in that, but I did it in cycles, in 10-session cycles. And so I would do a 10-session cycle and then stop. And some people would decide to do another cycle, and I would wait until I got enough people to do a group, and then I'd start another cycle. So it did cycles over 13 years. It really only stopped because I relocated about a decade ago from the Boston area where I was practicing down to Rhode Island, and the logistics of trying to keep it running were just too complicated, and so I stopped doing the group. That group was an amazing experience for me professionally and personally. I was blown away by the intensity of the suffering in the group, of the pain. It was a kind of grief that was, I've been around intense grief before, but not in which people, in addition to missing the person and feeling so much grief, also felt tremendously guilty about the death, or they felt ashamed about the death. So there's all this extra baggage that was there for people in the group, and I saw the tremendous relief that people felt when they could talk to someone else who was on the same path and had felt the same things. Um, and I became a big fan of bereavement support groups for suicide loss survivors, particularly, but just in general. I went on to help the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention develop a 2-day training that they still offer. I don't, they must be doing it online now. It's a 2-day training for people. We geared the training for lay people. Although a fair number of mental health professionals would come and take the training also, but it was a training for lay people about how to facilitate a bereavement support group for suicide loss survivors. Most of the people that took the training, almost all of them were survivors themselves and wanted to help. Some of them were in groups already. Some of them wanted to get one started in their community or whatever. So I helped AFSP design that and delivered that training many times over a number of years, which convinced me even more of the value of support groups as a way for survivors to help them with their healing process. Um, I've had a bit of experience, but not a lot of experience with working with people who were actively suicidal themselves. And most of that is working with survivors who, as a result of losing someone to suicide, are feeling suicidal themselves. So it's a particular kind of suicidality that comes from having someone right in front of you who's really important to you die by suicide, and it opens that door for people, in a way that they might never have thought about before. So that's really how I got into it. I just found it very satisfying because it was inspiring to me. Because I came to realize, and this is part of any training that I do now, well, particularly with mental health professionals, I say I'm clear that if you create the right kind of interpersonal context or setting for suicide loss survivors, which can be a one-on-one therapy relationship, but it often needs to also include connecting with other survivors. People can survive. They can get through the horrific pain and loss that comes from losing a child to suicide or losing your life partner to suicide. Um, and I think it takes that kind of support or help for that to happen for most people.
Yeah. Field of dreams.
Yes.
If you build it, they'll
that's
come.
right. If you offer it, they will come.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's amazing. It's. I mean, I think peer work, in almost any peer group where there's some sort of adversity is just so.
You're right.
You can't get that anywhere else.
Right.
You can't get the power of that knowing.
That community that's formed around that loss. I agree with that. And I think it's particularly true in suicide bereavement because of the stigmatization. Suicide can be a profoundly isolating loss because many people around the family, the individual or the family, either the family tries to hide it, and so it's never talked about, or the family isn't hiding it, but people don't know how to relate to people around that. If someone dies of cancer, most people feel like they know what they're supposed to do or what to say and what not to say, and that they're not sure about suicide.
Yeah.
And I call that social ambiguity, is that people are unclear about what the appropriate, supportive response is. And so what a lot of people do is they avoid the survivor, and that ends up with the survivor feeling very alone. And there's often this huge sigh of relief if you have an ongoing bereavement support group and a new survivor comes for the first time. You'll see them literally and metaphorically give out a huge sigh of relief, like, oh, okay, I can talk about it here. All the aspects of my grief, the trauma, the guilt, the shame, the yearning, the missing them, all of that I can talk about here, and people will get it and not judge me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've got so many different kind of life experiences where that is relevant. You know, losing a parent early in life. I lost my dad when I was 24, and he died in prison, and then not having a community around that. Being infertile, having a miscarriage, just all of these little silos where people do not talk about it.
Right. They can be very isolating.
Yeah.
And the last thing you need when you're grieving is to be alone.
Yeah, exactly.
For most people.
Exactly. So that concept is so powerful to me in so many different areas. What was I going to ask you? You mentioned this training that you've done with AFSP for lay people running groups, and I think that's so fascinating, because so often I feel like in the suicide field, it's like, no, you got to leave this to the professionals now. I love that you were like, nope.
I know. I'm aware of that.
These are the professionals.
Yep.
I think that's such a nice idea.
Well, I don't believe that, although I think lay people who don't know what they're doing can get themselves into trouble and even do some harm or damage sometimes, which is why we developed the training. But we explicitly conceptualized it as for lay people. What's interesting is that it turned out that a lot of people who would also attend the training would be clinicians. You know,
Where's the training
and
otherwise?
they would get a lot. Sorry?
Where's the training otherwise?
Well, that's true. That's true too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big part of why I wanted to do this project is the training is not there. And we talked about that a little bit, and wanting to create something for whoever comes next in wanting to learn about this, you know, like the overarching idea that I want to explore here is what's missing and how can we change that? What can we add to give it a presence? You know, why is this education missing? Why is this training missing? And how can we change it?
That's a noble life ambition. It's going to take you a lifetime to change it.
Yeah, right. And then it'll be like, well, we might move like half an inch,
10 feet. Yeah.
Right.
In the right
you're
direction.
more optimistic than me.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, joking about that, but it is changing.
You know
what's happening, and I'm lucky enough to be in a position because I know a lot of people in other countries who are, you know, my peers in terms of being interested in suicide bereavement. Suicide is coming out of the closet around the world. And it's more obvious in developed countries than in developing nations, where there still can be a tremendous amount of stigma about suicide, but it is coming out of the closet. And what's interesting to me is that it is primarily driven by people with lived experience. It's not coming from academia, you know, the top down. It's coming from people with lived experience saying, no, we got to do something about this. We have to help each other. We have to have services available for people. You know, we need, and the professionals, you need to get on board about this, wake up about it. So it's an amazing social movement to me that I've been lucky enough to watch happening for the last 25 or 30 years.
Yeah. Seems like a lot's happening in Australia and New Zealand specifically.
I just did literally 2 nights ago, there's an organization called Postvention Australia. And do you know them or know
I
of
know
them?
of them, yeah.
Okay, and they do an annual conference, and I just did a virtual presentation at the conference. I've admired what's going on in Australia. I don't know as much about in New Zealand, but it's probably similar. But what's going on in Australia around prevention and postvention for a long time. Yeah. I get people and tell them in Australia, say I have Australia envy. You know, I wish we had it here in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, as much kind of thoughtful programming and government support, federal support, and you know, state support for developing services.
Yeah. Yeah. When I try to think kind of beyond the one-on-one and kind of zoom out a little to the macro lens, I just keep thinking about HIV, AIDS, and cancer, and how those were also in a lot of ways really driven by lived
Absolutely.
experience. And
Absolutely. It's a good analogy. Yep.
yeah, the more we talked about it, the more it got airplay in the media. Cancer is a word we couldn't say, and now no one's afraid of it, and it's a part of life. I mean, of course, we're afraid of it.
People are afraid of it, but they're not afraid to talk about it.
It's a thing
For
that
the most part. It's still
Yeah.
a little bit stigmatized, but it's a huge change from what it was 30 or 40 years, in which you couldn't say the C word,
And the funding. And
yep.
oh my God, cancer and HIV AIDS
HIV
research.
is a good, yep.
Even as a member of the queer community, I was so ignorant of how relevant HIV AIDS still is to us as a like as a community, as a world community. I was looking into the funding. HIV AIDS has tons of funding. Cancer has tons of funding, billions and billions of dollars. Suicide, just it's not there.
Nope.
It's a fraction.
Yep.
And until we figure out what that formula is, we're not going to.
And thanks to people like Julie and Bill Fagelman and others, we know that many, many more people are exposed to suicide. The majority of people are exposed to the suicide of somebody they know over the course of their lifetime, and a certain subset of those people will be deeply impacted by it. And we know that people who've been exposed to suicide and are deeply impacted by it are at elevated risk for suicide themselves. And so Schneidman's dictum, however many years ago, that postvention is prevention of future suicides, is exactly true. But I this is my own soapbox I'm getting on, but the field of suicidology still treats postvention as the caboose. It's a nice thing to do. Of course, we want to help people who have been impacted by suicide, but it doesn't have to do with what we're doing. We're doing the real work of trying to prevent suicide, then start developing better postvention and make it universal for people if you want to prevent future suicides.
It's a chicken or the egg question, I think.
Sure. Exactly.
They cannot be one without the other.
Right. Yeah, but I think I did a literature review a couple of years ago about this. I think the empirical basis for that statement, that exposure to suicide increases risk, is robust and incontrovertible now. But the field doesn't take it seriously enough, in my opinion.
100%. I mean, God, I will put a link to Julie and Bill's articles. There are two specific ones I know you just referenced. I'll put a link in there in the notes, but that goes back to the 6 people are affected by every suicide death figure, and how mind-bogglingly false. It's wrong.
It became urban legend.
Yeah.
That's proven fact,
Yeah, and people still cite that all the time.
Yeah.
But rarely do they cite Julie's Not 6 article.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking about this CDC research that came out a couple of years ago, or a report, and I read the kind of larger research it came from, but where they talk about 54% of these people who died by suicide over a 17-year period didn't have a mental illness, and how that relates to the 90% figure, where we say 90% of people who died by suicide had a diagnosable mental illness at the time of their death. It's just it downplays the significance of it. It tries to pigeonhole people who have died and suicidal people into some boxes, and it's just there's something about the messaging in the field that is absolutely resistant to what we're seeing in the research too, that really bugs me.
I agree. Me too.
What that's about.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear the last thing. I'm sorry, it was breaking up a little bit. Say again.
Oh, what do you think that's about? Like, I don't
Oh,
know what
what's
that's.
that resistance about?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Well, it's speculation. I don't know. I think some of it is literally simply turf. People say, well, my turf is about suicide prevention, and your turf is about suicide postvention, and you stay out of my turf, and I'll stay out of your turf. Um, I think it's actually characteristic of medicine in general,
Mm.
and let me explain what I mean by that. Medicine, contemporary Western medicine, I should qualify and say that, has always been about curing people.
Mhm.
And therefore, when you can't cure people, many doctors and researchers and et cetera say, well, our job is done with this person is done. It's too late to do anything. So we don't need to invest anymore in this. Let's move on to the next person with cancer or the next person with whatever. Um, and that's why hospice formed, because the healthcare system simply wasn't interested in helping people die.
Mm.
It was only interested in curing people, and it made people feel like doctors and that I'm a failure if I can't save somebody. Um, and I think, in a sense, that's true in suicidology. Is our job is to save people, and if we can't save them from suicide, then our work is done with that person, rather than, oh, there's something we can do to not only that's the morally ethically right thing to do, which is to help people who are in extreme pain, but it's also a way of preventing them from becoming suicidal, both right away, but also down the road. You know,
Mhm.
um, and it's that kind of, our job is about life and saving people and curing people, not about dealing with death. It's a too broad a brush to paint the medical profession with, but I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, maybe I'm I'm still, a novice. I'm still learning, but I don't you can't cure grief. I don't think that once you're touched by grief, you're I don't think I'll ever be the same again now that I've lost my grandfather. I am a different person, and I will never be the same, and in some sense I will never be okay again. That's how I feel just losing him. It's still fresh. It's less than a year, but and the older you get, it's it's normative to have loss.
Absolutely. Um, I sometimes, when I'm trying to do a more general talk about grief and bereavement, I say that America has the this is ironic given what's going on right now in America, but the flu model of grief. Think about what happens when you get the flu. You feel you go downhill, you feel crappy for, it's relatively short lived, right? And then people start getting better in a step like fashion. Each day you get a little better, a little better, a little better. And then you just resume your life. You go back to the way it was, and you had the flu, a year ago.
Mhm.
You got through it. It was unpleasant. You got over it. You just go back to your life. That's not what happens when people have major losses in their life.
Yeah.
It changes them.
Yep.
Grieving is a process of absorbing this loss and making it part of your life narrative and who you are. It doesn't. It's not just an unpleasant experience to get over, but that's what society thinks. That's why people have like a week's, you know, bereavement leave from their company, and it didn't matter who died. If your
Yeah.
second, third cousin, died and you haven't seen them for 25 years, it's the same as if your child just died by suicide. You get the same amount of bereavement leave because society thinks it's all just an unpleasant experience. You get over it and put it behind you. I had a survivor, a suicide loss survivor, in a support group I was running. It was a father, used the most perfect metaphor about healing after grief. He was talking about his grief after the loss of his child, but he said, Dr. Jordan, people think when you're grieving, it's like having this heavy boulder put on your shoulder. And that what happens at some point is you just take that boulder and put it down by the road and you go on down the road. That's the flu model. It's an unpleasant experience, but it goes away and then you just go on down the road. He said, that's not what's happening to me.
Mm-hmm.
I well up when I think about it because it's so perfect. He said, that's not what's happening to me. What's happening to me is my back is getting stronger. Perfect.
Yeah.
People learn to carry their grief in a way that it doesn't feel so heavy or painful, but it becomes part of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's now part of their life journey, and important losses are just like that. Whether it's the suicide or not, this isn't just true of suicide bereavement.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, in my own life, as someone with lived experience, I feel like that is one of the reasons I appreciate aging. It's not just that I have lived experience. I have chronic suicidal thoughts. The wind could blow the wrong way and I'm like, oh, well, it would be better if I was dead. For no reason, and also for reasons. But I think of that a lot in terms of how we could work with suicidal people, and why aren't we focusing more on actually help, like not just curing them.
Right. Rid them of the virus they have.
Right.
Yeah.
Curing them, but how do you make the muscles stronger? Because that's what I think has kept me alive is
exactly.
For a decade I cut myself and that was my way of doing it. And then I realized this doesn't work. What else can I do? And we talk about self-care, but we don't actually talk about self-care and what it means and how do you, so much of what we're talking about feels like it can be generalizable and layered across, a number of contexts, but yeah, that the muscles, it's perfect. It is perfect. So because I'm curious about what's missing, what is there something that, I don't know, society needs to know or understand or do better? Clinicians, educational systems, the government, like concentric circles. What do people need to do better? What are the broad strokes?
Are we talking about suicide prevention, postvention, or both? All
of the above. Anything you want to touch on?
Okay. I think much of the work that has to happen is underway now, actually, which is because of the stigmatization of the topic. I think that's why it's not more prominent in mental health training programs, is because it's a residual of the stigma is that we just don't talk about this in society, and it has to become okay for people to. That's why the lived experience movement is so important in suicidology. This is suicidology's way of saying, no, we have so much we need to learn from people who've either lived with suicidality themselves all their life, or who have lived with losing someone to suicide, who have lived with someone who's been suicidal, or lived with the grief that comes afterwards. And we have to be able to talk about it and normalize that. And to the extent that we can do that and bring it out of the closet, it will be talked about more. I mean, grief is in general is somewhat taboo, although this has changed a lot in American society. But used to be when people were, I mean, it used to be, in certain subcultures, grieving was not only okay, was expected. And and if you were an Italian widow in an immigrant family and you lost your husband, you were expected to wear black the rest of your life. It was a social role that you took on as I'm a grieving widow, and the whole American thing is about let's get this cured and fixed and get you back out the door as quickly as possible. Treat them and treat them. Let's get them these grieving people fixed up on their way and get them over their grief. that's still a pervasive idea in medicine and in grief and bereavement, rather than let's help people learn to carry this and absorb it in a way that produces post-traumatic growth rather than damage to people. But part of the damage is because of the stigma attached to it.
Yeah, I think that you're making me think of, sitting Shiva. That's an expectation still in the Jewish culture.
Right.
7 days. This is
Right.
at least minimum 7 days. This is what we're doing here.
Right. But
And
it was a
then
public expected ritual.
yeah. And then also what we took, I don't know if I'm only thinking about in the States, when we medicalized death, we took death out of the home. And I feel like that has to have played a role in people's grief and in our inability to handle it. We used to wash the body of the person that we loved, and that was
right.
It was ritual.
We cared
but it was,
for our dead ourselves.
yeah.
Right.
I think that's got to play a role in not just grief,
Absolutely.
but also of the fear of suicide.
Absolutely. You're going to like it when you get to your first ADEC conference, because this is the kind of stuff people in ADEC talk about.
Right.
The sort of history of death and dying and attitudes about death and dying and that. But it's absolutely correct. Is that death got sanitized and compartmentalized and turned over to experts who were, including grief therapists, who were supposed to, help be experts in helping people grieve, because people Americans don't want to do death and dying except as entertainment. Think about how many TV shows begin with a homicide,
Or suicide.
or sometimes a suicide. Yep. But when was the last time you saw somebody dying in a television show of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in a nursing home? Wow, we don't want to know about real death the way that most Americans are going to die, of chronic illness. We want to know about exciting, dramatic death and watch it on TV so that it's not real to us. We can watch it and eat our popcorn and get a beer, and that kind of stuff. It's entertainment. And we have compartmentalized it instead of it being an integral part of people's lives. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing. It was several years ago now. My wife asked me to go to the movies with her, and she was like, I want to see this movie Birdman. And I was like, I don't want to watch the Michael Keaton being sad old Batman or something, like whatever it was. I didn't know what the movie was about. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and we were sitting, in the theater. And the moment I realized the movie was about suicide, I got really pissed off. I was like, can I please have a day off of this? Just a day where I'm not thinking about suicide.
Triggered about it.
Yeah. And I just started blogging whenever the topic of suicide came up in kind of my travels and in pop culture. Not even when I sought it out, because I do seek it out, I was writing something down almost every day, be it TV show, movie, music, podcasts. Almost every day it was coming up. It is so deeply set in I guess I don't know, zeitgeist is not the right word, but just our psyche. Like we want to touch it, but then we want to be able to walk away from it.
Yep. Well, that's why I think we like it as entertainment. Yeah. We want to be able to watch it and look at it and think about it, react to it, see how people behave around it, how they're supposed to behave, but we don't actually want it to happen to us.
Yeah. And I think another thing that's really interesting in having thought about this over time is, as a field, when talking about our messaging, we've got all these recommendations for journalists, no recommendations for the creative people who are making these films, writing these books.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And I'm like, journalists, like even, a journalist who's working on something in depth might write a book, but oftentimes it's, they're engaging with the content for a week or two, or maybe that's
exactly
the thing they focus on a lot. But people who are writing songs, who are writing books, who are making movies, they are engaging.
Yeah.
In this process long term.
That's a good observation. Yeah.
I'm just like, what? That's something we're missing. What is that about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
So what's your answer to your question to me about what within the field of suicidology and maybe more broadly, mental health care, what's missing? Are
everything.
you saying it now, or how would you answer your question?
Uh, for me, I think there's a massive messaging issue, a
Mm-hmm.
PR concern. um, I also think we're doing a lot of harm in marrying suicide and mental illness, and
Interesting. Yeah.
acting as if grief is irrelevant. I now I can't remember if we were recording yet or not recording when I talked about the class on grief I took last summer, but I remember people saying this is irrelevant to me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
People who are going into clinical work, grief is irrelevant to me. It's like, how? In your practice, in your life, there is nothing more relevant, nothing than grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think just kind of having somehow getting us to change our attitudes around grief and suicide being parts of life. Being just, you are going to encounter this. It's something that really bugs me when we talk about you don't want to normalize suicide because like people think it's okay, and it's like, no, that's not what normalizing it is. You normalize it because it's a part of life.
Right. Well,
And
you want to destigmatize it from
visualize
being
it, yeah.
something that literally can't be spoken about. The
Yeah,
elephant in the room that nobody can say there's an elephant in the room here.
exactly. It's there. Yeah, there are just so many layers to it, but I do think there's that kind of messaging piece and the acknowledgement piece, funding, research. Uh, Bringing in people with the various kinds of lived experience. And we have I think we have a decent amount of work around loss, suicide loss. Not even decent. I think we're just so far behind in general, but more research around loss, less around lived experience. But I don't think that in order to generate the knowledge, you have to have that lived experience involved in informing your scientific questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Ideally, the a way to think about that I've found useful for a long time, and again, if you get involved in ADEC, you'll be with people who sort of for whom this will not be a novel idea. We think of grief as the reaction people have when someone dies. What about if we think about grief is the reaction that people have when something changes? Because when something changes, um, you often discover that you're losing something,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's a change that you want.
Yeah.
You discover that you've lost something, and when something changes, there's also new doors that open when
Yeah.
that happens.
Yeah.
And if we thought about grief that way, there's a woman, a psychologist in ADEC. Do you know Darcy Harris or know of her work?
I don't think so. Not that I can remember, not by name.
Doesn't ring a bell for you. She's up in Canada. She's focused a lot of her work on and has a new book out, relatively new book out, called Non-Death Losses.
Yeah, or maturing.
Looking at losses that are embedded in our life experience
Mm-hmm.
that produce grief reactions, but are not related to the death of someone. You know, and if you think about loss and grief in a much broader sense like that, it's really about how people cope with change in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Usually we associate grief with negative changes, like bad things happening, changes that people don't want or didn't choose. Um, is that your dog?
Yeah.
Um, but but uh, but people can have things that they think are going to be wonderful happen, and they don't realize what they're also losing. You know, like I mean, this is a ridiculous example, but someone wins the lottery and they say, "Oh, I'm on easy street now. My life is all set for the rest of my life," and they found they've lost their privacy. They've lost their friendships. People treat them differently now. They may even be losing their losing their freedom in a lot of ways to just be
Mhm.
themselves and do what they used to do. You know, all kinds of things they never even thought about that are embedded in that change that produce. Then in a way you have to kind of mourn that. Mourning in part recognizing what it is that you've lost, being able to name it and point at it and say and connect it to what you're feeling.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can be feeling upset or distressed if you win the lottery, because of all these things that have happened. That's a kind of grief response.
Parenthood.
Parenthood. Perfect.
Parenthood.
Perfect. Kids grow up, and the first day that kids go to kindergarten, your
Mhm.
your child goes to kindergarten. Parents have it's a joyous day. It's a sad day.
Yeah.
It's a grief response
Yeah. It's just it's so deeply relevant
to
to
everything.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This we need to I really want people to talk about it more. But though I do find there's a there's a permission that when people I don't know your experience, but I know that when I start talking about, whatever I'm reading about with regard to suicide or grief, the moment I start talking about it, people do want to engage. That's another
People means anybody or
almost
people in
anybody.
your social work class, or who by people, who do you mean?
Social work less so, actually. But
There's the problem.
hmm but before I was in this program, I remember thinking the messaging around, oh, people don't want to talk about that was so strange, because I can think of the oddest contexts where I've experienced where people have asked me, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, well, I do this. I'm a photographer, and I do this project around suicide attempt survivors, and I talk about suicide every day. And they're like, oh, let's discuss this outside of a strip club. That happened, like uh, opening a bank account, um, talking to the breeder for the puppy I got. Just
And I bet what happens is that people will talk about it, and I'm sure this is changing. Some of the shame and taboo it really is diminishing, but is that people then will tell you their own personal story of how suicide or grief or a loss has impacted them, and they welcome the opportunity to be able to talk with somebody about it. But
permission.
that may indicate that they don't feel like they have many other opportunities in their life to talk about. They may be willing to talk to you about it because they see you as now somebody that is safe to talk about. It's like I mean, every suicide loss survivor I've ever known has stories about after they became a survivor and they were public about it. People who they've known for 30 years come up to them and say, well, I never told you this, but my father or my uncle or my
Mhm.
sister killed herself. Um, and they'll tell you their story, how it affected their life. And so that permission to talk about it,
Yeah.
you may be getting that because people see you as
Yeah.
a safe person to talk about it, but they may
Yeah.
not talk more about it in the rest of their life very
Yeah.
much.
Okay, so I'm going to edit the statement. People may not talk about it, but they sure do want to. I think they
There
absolutely
you
want.
go. There you go. I completely agree with that.
Yeah. And so that permission piece is just it's so
Right, right,
huge.
right.
So huge. Um what do you think, so given that we lack the training, and I'm trying to get it out there, and you're obviously um why can't I think of the word? You're retired and still doing trainings.
Mhm.
What do we what, what's the best way for people to kind of like go down this path? I mean, not everyone's going to have the privilege I do of, you know, just randomly getting in touch with Jack Jordan to have a private conversation.
Mhm.
Where should we start? Where should we start?
Well, I think one thing to do is particularly if we're talking about training and training uh, mental health clinicians, caregivers, not
Mhm.
just therapists, but caregivers. So we're talking about healthcare professionals, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is that it needs to be a mandatory part of training, and the way to make that happen is you have to make it required for licensing.
Mhm.
I think that movement's a very powerful movement to make training in suicide prevention work, but I would add postvention work should be mandatory for all mental health professionals in their licensing, and that they have to get a refresher thing once every 5 or 10 years or something like that. I
Mhm.
think that's a way to literally a political way to make it required.
Yeah. I think of that a lot, and I put together an issue brief about this a while back. The things that have been most useful in my MSW education so far are the macro pieces, where I'm able to connect what I already know about, suicide, and
Interesting.
all the stuff we're talking about, but then being able to write an issue brief and say, okay, here's the problem. Like, why aren't we getting training? Who's not getting training? But um, how this issue affects so many of us across kind of the mental health field,
Mhm.
how many of us are affected. One thing I noticed is if we don't have people trained, where are the trainers?
If we don't have people trained, what?
Where are the trainers? There aren't even
Oh,
enough
who can
out
do the
there.
training?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a chicken or egg thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you've got, the trainings that are out there are either too expensive or they're QPR or,
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
it's it's rough. QPR is something, but it's not enough, and it's
Yeah.
inaccurate
No,
in a lot of
it's
ways.
it's fine for what it is, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient.
Yeah,
A single, day of QPR training is not sufficient.
yeah.
Do you know about the other training that I developed with AFSP and AAS, the clinician training?
You're doing it's a pre-conference workshop for AAS, right? Have I heard?
May have been. I'm sure I've done it for AAS. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's called the Suicide Bereavement Clinician Training Program. All right. I've
Yeah.
been doing it for probably 8 to 10 years.
Mm,
It came out of conversation. Julie was part of this conversation in which I was talking with people from AFSP and AAS and other people in the field about the lack of training. Um, and horror stories that I'd heard from other people who've been to see other therapists who when I do the clinician training, I always give this example of a woman I saw who'd lost I think it was her daughter to suicide, and she'd been to see another therapist. Um, and the other therapist, when she went to see a therapist, she was pretty raw, pretty new in her grief.
right.
The other therapist said to her after 3 sessions, said, "You're dwelling on this too much," and wanted to start doing cognitive behavioral therapy with her to change her quote unquote negative thinking about her daughter's suicide. And my heart stopped, my jaw dropped open, I cringed, I almost threw up, but I thought, damn, we have to do something about this.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know the therapist, but I have no reason to think the therapist was, just an idiot or something. I have every reason to think they were just ignorant.
Yeah.
They didn't know what the territory looks like, and they'd gotten no training in it. And I said, we need to take the responsibility of training people. So what I did is I took training I was doing already for a while, sort of tweaked it and polished it specifically for therapists. I'm very, very fortunate. I had a client who was a remarkable woman who lost her son to suicide. Who early on in the therapy, I said to her, I think we're going to work well together. I think I can help you, and I think we're gonna work well together. And I do a lot of training. Would you be willing to allow me to videotape our sessions? And she said, sure. And so I have all of our grief therapy sessions videotaped. And what I do is in this training, I play clips from the work that I did with her. And therapists are like, this is amazing. This is not that I'm so amazing, but it's so great to be able to actually watch
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing and link it to what I'm teaching, over the course of the day. The other thing that we did is that I insisted that we set up a searchable online database, and clinicians who take the training, who are licensed mental health professionals in their state, wherever they are, and are willing to have their contact information listed, can put it into the database so that survivors have some rational basis for looking for therapists. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not an endorsement. We don't say this is the person you want to see, anything. It's just that we list their contact information and a caveat about, you should always
Mm-hmm.
meet them and talk to them and, shop for a therapist. But, and it's beginning to work now. I don't know how many, we've got several hundred clinicians in it now. And, I've had people tell me they found a therapist through that service. So it's, for me, it's a kind of legacy thing that I want to leave, is that to have better trained clinicians around the country, and to have
Mm-hmm.
a method by which survivors can find a therapist that isn't just taking a name off a list from an insurance company of people, because every clinician in the country says they do grief work.
Yeah.
They'll list it as part of what they do,
Yeah.
but it's just not true that they have really relevant experience to working with traumatic losses, and
Yeah.
particularly with suicide bereavement.
Yeah. That's yeah. It just brought up three big thoughts for me. Most recently, I'm looking for my clinical placement right now, and I'm older. I'm in this field. I'm probably also not going to be working with phobias. Deeply unlikely. And so I'm looking for a placement that obviously I need to do some phobia work. I need to get my chops, but
Yeah.
it's something that can give me both things, the specialized and the generalized. And did this amazing interview with this. Sorry about my dog.
No problem.
With this practice, and we were talking logistics. It sounded like it was going to have a good outcome for me. And then I got an email a couple of days later after I was offered a second interview that said, you know what, actually, we think this isn't a good fit for you because you have a perspective that's too well developed. You
Interesting.
believe in disclosure, and we want generalists and blank slates. And I'm like,
Interesting. We think we can't teach you anything. That's
yeah.
interesting. Huh.
It's like, I'm not your guy, but also
What kind of setting was this? You don't have to name the setting, but what kind of setting was it?
Just a
Community mental health agency, or what?
it
What
was
was it?
a private therapy practice.
Oh, okay.
But the interesting piece of it was that they have a person on staff who's actually the person who connected me, who is deeply specialized, more so than even a suicide specialization or a grief specialization.
Mm-hmm.
But when this person wrote back to me and said they want generalists, and I looked back at their website, I saw that thing that I see on a lot of therapist websites where it's like, I specialize in these 20 things. And it's like, that does not make you a specialist. And
Right.
I would argue that if you're adding more than 2 to 3 things on that list, you're probably not.
You're not a specialist then.
At all.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that the next thought I had when you were talking was that you were talking about shopping. People do not know how to do this. I've come across so many people who have asked for my help over the years.
Yep.
And the first step is, again, messaging, reach out. You can't just reach out to anybody.
Yep.
But people don't know how to, even if they could get past all of the shame and the fear of being coerced into care, forced into care. They find a therapist and they think that every therapist can do the job because that's what we want people.
That's right. That's right. All therapists are trained to do this, right? Right. Right. No. I totally know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I do in addition to the clinician training for AFSP, I don't just do that for AFSP, but That's where it developed.
Yeah.
NAAS. I I do a 2-hour workshop, a community workshop for suicide loss survivors. That's mainly a psychoeducational thing. And I talk about what do we know about what contributes to suicide in general. What do we, and what are some of the factors that seem to influence people taking their life. We talk about grief after suicide and how it's different than grief after, both the same and different from grief after other kinds of losses. I talk about self-care, what people can do to help themselves, and I talk about when it's a reasonable thing to think about seeing a mental health professional and what to look for. And it's the most no-brainer stuff, which is it's okay to ask them, are they a survivor themselves? You know, it's okay to say how many survivors have you worked with approximately, in your life. So are you really familiar with this? Do you have any specialized training that's specifically about either traumatic loss or specifically suicide bereavement?
Yeah.
Just to say it is okay it is okay to shop.
Yeah. It's huge. If you
Yeah.
have access to, if you can choose, how do you? I was
Exactly.
talking to someone about that, in terms of they were saying they have experience with obsessive suicidal thoughts. So talk about a specialization. And I was like, you've got to interview people. You've got to make a list and set up some consults. And if they don't want to give you a consult, scratch them off.
Right.
Here are the
Exactly.
questions you start asking.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a huge educational task that actually AAS and ADEC and other organizations concerned with grief and bereavement, particularly after suicide, could be doing a better public education job of public education, educating people about how to look for therapists.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was yelling about this a couple of weeks ago. I think that will be my September focus. Maybe I really can't stand Suicide Prevention Month, and I waffle back and forth between do I need to not participate because I think that this should be happening all year long, or do I need to refute the myths that I see being thrown out, or where is the most useful place to be? And I think this year it's okay. Sure, if we're going to reach out, how do we do it? Let's do some practical skills here. So yeah, I think that'll be what I'm going to do this year. Probably before that, honestly, I need to write it up though. But we only have a few minutes left. I'm trying to think, what is my question? I don't know. What do you want to leave people with? If anything, what one thing? If they only watch these last 2 or 3 minutes, what should they know?
Well, family, it's a question I should have asked before we even started talking. Who typically is going to see this?
Well, you are my guinea pig.
Sorry?
You're my guinea pig for this particular podcast idea.
For this podcast, but who comes to your website and that in general?
Usually, well, I would say it's probably maybe 60, 40, 70, 30 people with lived experience of suicidality.
Okay.
Level and loss survivors. I've found that I didn't create Live Through This, the project, for loss survivors necessarily. I also didn't create it to be an educational resource. So it's taken on a whole life of its own, which is incredible. Yeah. But I found that people with lived experience have the Me Too feeling, and then loss survivors come to the stories that I share, and they find a little bit of understanding, a little bit of perspective they may not have had. And then in terms of the podcasts, I've been working on the Suicide and Stuff podcast. We're getting, it's mostly academics and researchers, I think, who are watching that. So
what is the third thing you're mentioning? What is the focus of that? I know about Live Through This, I think a little bit, but what's the focus of the third thing that you mentioned? The
Suicide and Stuff podcast?
Yeah. What is it?
It's we're just talking about suicidology from a critical suicidology lens. It's me and Jess Stolman Rainey, who is another um, loss survivor, attempt survivor. All of the identities, and it's it's put there for us to talk about it, to make light of it, to be ridiculous, but also to have some really kind of hardcore suicidology people. We had our most recent episode. I don't know if you know Dr. Mike Anestis. We had him on to talk about
So,
firearm research and suicide. And
mhm.
the episode before that, we had Dr. Carrie Journey, who does, she's a neurosurgeon for dogs, and to talk about veterinary suicide. So
Interesting.
anything, you would actually be a fantastic guest. So I may have to bother you about that in the future. But yeah,
Okay.
anything related to
Okay. Okay.
suicide.
Okay. Okay.
So
Um,
it's really anybody who comes.
okay.
Yeah.
What would I say? Um, for people who are watching this, who are here because they're watching this because they're loss survivors, okay, um, I would want to leave a message of hope that it is, in fact, it can be survived emotionally, psychologically. Because, and I say that not because I've lived through the loss of someone really important or close to me to suicide, but because I've worked with so many people and known so many people who've done that. I know that human beings, even when they feel like I don't know how I can go another day or another week with this terrible grief, and pain and shame and that, um, is that people can and do survive it. You need to get yourself the kind of interpersonal context I've talked about a couple of times, in which someone journeys with you in a non-judgmental way, who gets what the territory is about. And that may be another survivor, it may be a support group, it may be, I mean, some people get it to an extent by reading the accounts of other survivors. Certainly the Alliance of Hope is a way to connect with other
Mhm.
survivors, but it can be survived. Um, I don't know if you'll agree with this or not. I want to say this diplomatically and compassionately. For people who come who are struggling with their own suicidality that are listening to this,
Mhm.
um, I want you to know that life can be worth living, but oftentimes, not often, not infrequently, people who are suicidal have rationalized in their head that the suicide is, they've become a burden. It's Tom Joyner stuff, that they become a burden on other people, and that the suicide is almost a kind of self-sacrifice. I will unburden you by ending my own life, and then you can get remarried to some other guy, who makes more money or who's a better father or whatever, better husband, etc. Um, and all I want to say is that I believe in people's ultimate right to end their life.
Oh, I don't
Um,
disagree with that at all.
no, that's not what
Okay.
so I want to say that is that I'm not trying to take away someone who's got suicidal thinking and is struggling with it. I'm not trying to say, and you should never think about ending your life. It's just immoral, or you're going to go to heaven, or a
Mhm.
terrible thing to do. But I do want you to think about the impact of that decision on other people around you who love and care about you, because your thinking about that may be mistaken.
Mhm.
I've maybe I only see survivors who've been hurt by it tremendously, but most survivors I know would not say, I would have given anything to have them stay alive, and they didn't understand. And they asked me, did they understand that what the impact of this was going to be on me or our kids or whatever? And I say, well, it's quite possible they didn't. They were in a state of consciousness that they thought that they were actually helping. You know, that may seem perverse to you, but it's true. And so people ask me as a clinician, if I was working with someone who's suicidal, would I tell them what I know about the impact of suicide on survivors? And I say, yeah, I do. I think in that decision-making process, that ought to be part of the equation.
Yeah. 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 Actually, that makes me think. I think a lot about duration, how the duration of time from decision to action, um, which doesn't even get necessarily to someone who's chronically suicidal. I think there's almost a privilege in being chronically suicidal where you do have time to maybe think of that, as you have these thoughts.
Ponder it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. But we're seeing all of this research now. I think that also links back to the CDC thing, where a lot of the people who don't have diagnoses are men who use guns. And there's no time for that. And so how do you almost want to get people to think about suicide? What would happen if?
The consequences of it, right?
But we have existentialism, like it's yeah. No, I do think that's a really important
a variation of this or an extension of this is I've thought a lot about the whole medical aid in dying, physician-assisted suicide thing, and I support it. But I support it, but I think like other major medical decisions that people make, including decisions about like stopping treatment. I don't want any more chemotherapy, which in a sense is a kind of suicidal act. It's saying, I know I'm going to die, but I don't want to keep living this way,
Yeah, rejecting nutrition.
I think those decisions in the best of all possible worlds should be made communally, not by a person who's isolated, alone, feeling in tremendous psychological pain and is deciding the only option they have is to end their life without any discussion with people around them about it. So I would like to see medical aid in dying become legalized everywhere, but I would like to see it be practiced in a way that families have input into it.
Yeah. Well, you have, I'm just assuming you know Peggy Batten.
I know who she is. Yeah. I don't know her, but I know who she is.
I love her so much. She talks about the good death. And I think medical aid in dying, if you had somebody who is suicidal and they're in crisis, number one, I almost think that introducing the hurdles of bureaucracy, if you had legalized dying, you could be like, you're in crisis, you want to kill yourself, fill out this application and we'll get back.
Right. We'll get back to you. Yeah.
You can't maintain that crisis for that long. You might come back to it, but then you're almost practicing that basic need for distraction
to slow the process down. Yeah.
Yeah, but also the good death. Like if you are a chronically suicidal person, if you are someone who, almost all of the people who have died who I've interviewed for live through this, who've died from suicide. There have been 5 of them now. 40s, 50s, long history of trauma, long history of doing all the things we tell people to do, meds, therapy, all the things. And for whatever reason, they couldn't stay anymore. What if they had that option? And what if we said, yes, you can die, and you're not going to die alone, and you're not going to die alone.
And we're not going to, if we come together and you really convince us, not that you have to have our permission, but that this is the best option for you, we'll support you.
Yeah, like I think that would change so much. I agree.
And it would also make suicide not a perverse, stigmatized act. It would make it a part of caregiving for people who are suffering terribly, and medicine has not been able to help them. Medicine and religion and the community have not been able to ease that suffering.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'd like to see that happen. I had a case once. I presented it once or twice, I think, at AAS, because it was a case that really got me thinking a lot about this. I had a woman got referred to me by a clinician who knew that I did a lot with suicide bereavement, and she came to me. She called me and explained their situation, which was that her partner of many years was suicidal. Um, he told me when I met with him that he remember being suicidal when he was 9 years old. Since he was in the age of 9, wanting to die, and he was getting closer to it. And She was referred to me to sort of help her get ready for it. And I said on the phone, well, I'm going to do this a little bit differently. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you and your partner, if you would, I'd like to see both of you. And I'm going to treat this the same as I would treat someone who was, had a life-threatening terminal illness, and they were saying, I don't want any more treatment. I want to stop treatment. But their partner was saying, but I want you to keep trying. And so it's a couples issue about they're in different places about this. And my job is going to be to try to see if I can just help the two of you talk about it and think it through and look at the consequences, not just for each of you, but they didn't have children, but for your friends and family and all that kind of stuff, and make a kind of considered decision about it. And if that means for the woman to what could potentially happen is if he does end his life, you'll be a little more. You'll feel like you've done what you can, and you'll be a little more prepared for it, and maybe even have a little more peace of mind about it. Because it's like if your husband said, "I don't want any more chemotherapy," And I didn't see him very long, only a few sessions. I don't know what happened. I don't know whether he eventually took his life or not. But that's the conversation that we had for 3 or 4 sessions about, is this a decision that you can somehow reach some kind of consensus about? I mean, what they did with me is they agreed that he was going to try deep brain stimulation, which he had not tried. He tried just about everything else, but he was going to try this. He really had, suffered from chronic depression also, and he agreed that he was going to try that. And she agreed that if he still felt the same way after he'd given that a fair trial, that she would be. She couldn't say I'll accept it, but she could say I will probably be more accepting of it. And I don't know what happened. We reached that consensus, and then they stopped.
Right.
But that made me think a lot about, could we treat suicide differently in a way that says it ought to be a communal decision, with the ultimate power residing in the person who wants to die. Assuming they're not psychotic, they're not literally out of their mind and don't know what they're doing. But
Right.
I think that would be such a transformation of the meaning of suicide in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, yeah. And I think that's so important. Having these conversations is so great. I'm glad that we especially got that last bit down here, because it's
What we
just,
just talked about now.
yeah,
Okay.
so powerful. It just, so controversial and so important, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I
Good.
love it. Thank you so much.
Good.
I could talk
You're
to you
welcome.
all day long. So
Likewise, you're very easy to talk to, and we think similarly, I think, about a lot of things, a lot of issues.
yeah,
I think
this
you're
has
also
been
doing great
fun.
work.
Thank you.
What
Thank
you're doing, a real service to people.
Thank you. Same. I think this is wonderful. I'm so glad that you were willing to take a chance on me.
I'd heard of you already.
Huh?
I think I first. I'm sorry.
Oh, what'd you say?
I think I first heard about you from Franklin Cook.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think I've heard Franklin talking about you once, and then Julie,
Mhm.
had mentioned you and that. So I knew of you, but had never
Right.
sat and talked with you like this.
I know. It could go either way. I seem to be polarizing, so I'm glad I
I mean, people just really oppose what you're doing or
so
disapprove of it.
yeah. Some people don't like my tone or whatever. I don't really I don't know. I'm just so transparent and I don't mince words when something upsets me and
Yeah.
I let people know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, but and also the work too, and being I guess being controversial. I don't know. I don't think these conversations should be controversial, and I don't know if that's lived experience or an interest in philosophy or any of these things. But this is how we learn. So
Here's a question:
mm.
If you weren't, doing what you're doing, and if you weren't about to become an official social worker, what would you be doing?
I don't know.
But it had the same life experience.
I honestly
I don't
don't
know.
know.
You didn't want to be a famous chef or something when you were growing up, or things like that, or an artist or something.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I am an artist, but like when I was growing up, I wanted to be a chef. Yes, I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a writer, a musician. So
You're
an
an
art,
artist in the sense that as a photographer, you mean, or
yeah,
uh
yeah.
okay.
Um, I wanted to do various different things with art, but
Okay.
when I got to losing my first friend to suicide, when I started experiencing my own suicidality and realized I don't feel like I have safe adults in my life to talk to about this. I wanted to be a therapist. I wanted to do suicide research.
Okay.
I was 16. So
Okay.
um,
It's a calling.
yeah, this is the thing I care about. So I think I would be deeply unhappy if I wasn't doing this.
Yeah. Okay.
I love it. I love it too much, and I care about it too much.
You care about the subject matter of what you're doing, Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if I wasn't doing it in a traditional way like I am now, I would have been doing it in a non-traditional way, which is what I've done for a decade.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you cook a lot?
Uh,
Are
no,
you
not
are you a
really.
foodie? Is what I'm asking, I
We
guess.
do love food. Yes, we do
Okay.
love food in this house.
Okay.
My wife is she's more of a cook, and I'm more of the baker.
Okay.
There's a little more calculation and kind of specificity in the baking, I think, and
Precision. Yeah.
I enjoy that. Um,
Okay.
I cook mostly when I'm working through something, I think, as kind of a coping. So the baking specifically helps me not think about all the
Interesting.
things I'm thinking.
Interesting.
Yeah, the measuring gets me out of it, out of my head.
That's literally a way of self-regulating and
Mhm.
comforting yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started making candles this past year for very similar reasons.
Cool.
There's a little math involved, a little measurement.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to
Thank you.
do this.
Yeah.
I think our paths hopefully think it's pretty likely we'll cross again at some point.
Absolutely. I will be bothering you in the near future about something inevitably.
Okay. I don't
Or
know if I
just to say
signed on to
hi.
that, but okay.
Just
Depends what you're
hi,
bothering me about.
But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Be well.
You too.